At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community. I'm Elena Gomez.
And I'm Melissa Martinez, and on this episode of At the Edge of It All, we speak with Dr. Jena Hales, who talks to us all about memory.
Yeah, she told us a little bit about how our memories are formed and how time and space plays a real role in that. Let's take a listen. So your research looks at memory formation and also how we retrieve our memories. So this is a really interesting topic. Before we dive into that, though, how did you get interested in this specific field?
Well, my first real exposure to neuroscience was when I was an undergraduate student at Bowdoin College in the Northeast. And I was taking a neuropsychology course with one of my professors. It was during my sophomore year. And I loved the class. And after class one day, he said, "Do you need a job on campus?" And I said, "Actually, I do need a job on campus." And he asked, "How would you like to take care of the lab rats?" And so I thought, well, this is great. I need a job. And it was really just his way to get me into the lab, have me start seeing what his students were doing, and kind of exposed me to research for the first time. So I started shadowing his older students in the lab, and I got really excited. And then he suggested, why don't we put in a grant for summer research? And so that was really how I got involved in it in the first place. And that research was doing somewhat similar stuff to what I've continued doing. At the time, we were looking at how memories are stored in the brain and how we can see representations of those memories in parts of the brain that we may have not even thought of as being really involved in the first place.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah. So the research I did as an undergrad and that I've continued to do now really looks at how certain brain regions, specifically brain regions such as the hippocampus, are important in the formation and retrieval of memories. And while we know that the hippocampus is critically involved in memory formation and retrieval, we also know from key studies of human patients who've had damage to their hippocampus that it can't be the final repository for long-term memories. And the reason for this is famous patients like HM, after his medial temporal lobes and hippocampus were removed due to a seizure disorder, he was still able to tell you things about his childhood. So a lot of his memories before the surgery, within the 5 to 10 years or so before the surgery, were gone. He had difficulty forming any new long-term memories, but he could still talk all about his childhood. And so it raised these interesting questions of how is the hippocampus so important for forming and temporarily storing memories, and yet our most remote memories seem to be intact even without this brain region. So that study I was doing was looking at how when rats are forming memories, hippocampal-dependent memories for sequences of events, can we find any neurological evidence for it being stored in the cortex outside of the hippocampus? And so we would have rats smell a sequence of odors, and then we were able to start seeing neural firing that anticipated the presentation of a subsequent odor, but in the cortex. And so that was my undergraduate research, and that really led me into wanting to continue asking questions within neuroscience and more specifically trying to understand memory.
Do you remember what was it about that class that really intrigued you? Had you thought about this earlier on, or it was specifically the way that professor explained things or what you learned in that class that really for the first time triggered this interest in you?
That's a good question. I think ever since I was a kid, I was interested in science, and it would bounce around between fields. I went through a phase where I liked the idea of studying archaeology and some kind of like ancient grounds and learning more in that realm. And then I moved over into more medical sciences. And as a kid, I was just interested in anything science. And I think it was towards the end of high school where, although I was very interested in kind of how people work, how we think, how we learn, I wanted to understand the biological mechanisms that support those cognitive functions. And so it really pointed me right towards neuroscience. So when I applied to undergrad, I was drawn to Bowdoin because they had a neuroscience major, and it was something I could study specifically when I was there. So I think I've always been interested in science. It's just I really like understanding psychological concepts and how psychological processes occur, but then what are the mechanisms underlying them?
What has been the single most like aha moment for you in your years of research?
I think over time, each question that we have asked has really led to the next question. I would say in my early research, the first time that I was doing actual neurophysiological recordings and we saw evidence of a cortical representation for hippocampal dependent memory was pretty cool. But I would say in some of my more recent work, when we would, as my research has evolved, I've become more and more interested in some of the temporal aspects of memories. We know that all of our past memories, when we recall some sort of event from our past, they are all grounded in space and time. We can come up with kind of where were we when something was occurring. We have some kind of timestamp, sometimes general timestamp as to when it happened. And as I became more interested in those aspects of memory, we started thinking about how do we model this in the lab? How is this something that we can look at? How is the brain involved in these temporal aspects of the memory? And so in the lab we developed, and this was working with a collaborator of mine, we developed a behavioral paradigm where rats needed to pay attention to time, and specifically time elapsing in order to make a decision.
How?
And so the way we did this, and this was coming along the time where some of the big findings about hippocampal function were that there was evidence of cells that fire in a time-specific way. Back in 2014, the Nobel Prize was given in physiology for the discovery of spatially selective cells in the hippocampus and the regions outside, things like place cells and grid cells. And so I was having a lot of my research findings were showing evidence of other kind of firing, or I'd say other kind of involvement of the hippocampus outside of space and more in kind of temporal domains. And so around that time, there were studies coming out about this temporally selective firing, but most of those studies, the rats didn't have to pay attention to time. It almost just seemed like these cells may be keeping track of time, but is it relevant to the animal? And so in the lab, we developed a behavioral paradigm where the rats would travel around what looks kind of like a figure eight maze, where there's a rectangular track and a central arm down the middle. So the rat runs up the central arm, turns down one arm, side arm, and then goes back to the center arm again, and then down the other arm, kind of in a figure eight pattern. And what we would do is when they would get to the end of the central arm, there would be a door that holds them in that space. And they could be held for 10 seconds or they could be held for 20 seconds. And at the end of the 10 or 20 seconds, we'd lift the door and the rat can choose to turn to the left or the right. And what we would train them on trial after trial is that they will only get a reward, a cocoa pebble, if they turn to the left following a 10-second delay, but they'd only be rewarded if they turn right following a 20-second delay. And so time was the manipulated variable that the rat had to attend to. Now, with any kind of animal research, the hardest thing is you can't tell them what to do. You can't give them verbal instructions. You have to kind of slowly over time shape their behavior through trial and error and reinforcement. And so we weren't sure if they could even learn this. Like, could they learn to pay attention to duration of elapsed time as the meaningful kind of variable? And they could. It was hard. They had to do lots of trials.
Like how long did you have to train
weeks.
for this? Weeks. Wow.
Weeks. To reach a high level of performance.
Right.
And we were training them till they reached like 90%, 36 out of 40 trials correct in a given day. And then once they achieved this, we would perform brain-based manipulation to disrupt parts of the functioning of the hippocampus to then see how does that affect their ability to continue to do this discrimination and use time in this way. And we found that the hippocampus is really critical. And without a hippocampus, the rats became very challenged in being able to make the discrimination. Every other part of the behavior was fine. And actually, they were okay on the 10-second delay, but they became at chance level of performance once the delay extended to 20 seconds. And so it really showed that the hippocampus was critical in that kind of time-based discrimination and using the duration of elapsed time in order to make a decision and to remember which way they're supposed to turn based on it. And so this kind of then opened up a whole other area of inquiry for us in the lab after we developed this behavioral paradigm, and we were able to probe how the brain region, or how different brain regions were involved in the performance on this task.
So at a granular level, for a memory to form, any memory, is time and space necessary? Are both of those things necessary to form a memory?
Oh, that's a great question. So both of those seem to really be they seem to contribute to the memory. In terms of what the brain is paying attention to, your brain is going to be taking in all sorts of information all the time. And usually it's whatever is most relevant to the animal. And this is likely why space has been such a key piece of what people have looked at. Especially rodents. They will forage, they store food in different areas. So it's very natural for them to have to pay attention to their spatial location. And so a lot of times studies were able to pull out these kind of spatial representations in their neural firing, or in how it influences their ability to remember something. We're also seeing time as a really relevant factor. Now, in terms of how memory, we have different types of memories that we store. So far, and what I really research is focusing more on what we call declarative memories. So declarative memories are memories that, it's what we typically think of as memory. It's things that are available to conscious introspection. So, do you remember what you had for dinner last night? Do you remember what you did for your last birthday? Do you know the capital of California? Facts and events. We have other kinds of memories too. So we have other types of memory that don't require the hippocampal memory system. And those are things like skill-based learning. Like we know if we know how to ride a bike. That's a declarative memory of the fact that we know how to ride a bike. But the actual skill of riding a bike that's slowly acquired over time with repetition and repeated experience, that's a totally different kind of memory that involves different brain regions.
It's like that saying, it's like riding a bike.
It's like riding a bike.
You'll just remember.
Yeah, people usually call it like muscle memory. Right. But really, it's not stored in the muscles. It's stored in a different area of the brain.
What about core memories? I remember that from Inside Out.
The things that are kind of true to our core and shape. That's so an interesting thing about memory is we think so much that memories hold on to our past. And that's true. Memories make up our entire understanding of ourselves from our past experiences. But I think sometimes the thing that people don't realize about memories until memories get disrupted through illness or disease or injury is memories are critical for us to be able to make decisions in our present. The way we make decisions are oftentimes based on this accumulation of lived experiences that help us decide what to do. But also memories help us plan for our future. So much of our thinking about things we want to do in the future, imagining future scenarios or plans is all based off of our past experience. So the interesting thing, we think so much about memories as a record of our past, but it's also just absolutely critical for making decisions in the present and planning for the future. So when we think of core memories, these past experiences also have such a present and future consequence.
Well, I think it's really interesting that whenever I've heard people give testimony of like a near-death experience or something, they always mention like your life flashes before your eyes, which is, I'm assuming it's like a combination of memories, right? That just come rushing out. So interesting how what's happening in our brains, what we've lived, what we remember is always a part of you at any moment, regardless of the type of moment, right?
And it also highlights time being this interesting feature. And although time is kind of somewhat of a constant, it goes faster or slower at different times, right? People talk about those moments of stress. If there's some really acute thing happening, it almost feels like time slows down. Or at other times, like things are just racing by so fast. So time is a fascinating thing in the way it contributes to our memories. And there's been some research looking a little bit at things that seem to speed up or slow down our own perceptions of time. And so that is something that I would like to kind of potentially get into in future research.
I wonder if you could explain the importance of your type of research to people like me, to people who may be listening at home or at work or in their car right now. Why is it important to understand what it is that you're researching?
So I think a few things. I think one, because of how central memories are to who we are, it's so important to understand what's happening. Basic research, which my research is really more at the level of trying to understand these systems in the brain that support functions. Basic research is so critical for us to be able to understand how our brain is working. It's what we're doing all the time, and yet there is still so much about the brain that isn't understood. And so for one reason, I think it's just so critical for us to understand what it is that's happening, how different brain regions are involved in that process. But I think also because one of the most devastating consequences of many diseases or injuries is when people lose memory function. And so, I mean, this is obviously the key feature with degenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease. It's a feature of other degenerative disorders, such as some forms of like a Parkinson's with dementia, some forms of frontal temporal dementia. There are all sorts of other dementias outside of just Alzheimer's. And then also following any kind of traumatic brain injury, we can see whether it's temporary or long-term losses of memory function. And so I think studying memory is so critical. So if we understand better how it works and the key brain regions involved and the processes involved, we can better understand either how to slow, prevent, or support disruptions that can happen in memory with any of these diseases or disorders.
And the research is so important that here at the University of San Diego, your team has branched off into its own separate department, the Department of Neuroscience, Cognition and Behavior. So why was it so important to separate yourself from other disciplines within your same field? And what do you hope this department can bring to our local community in San Diego and outside of that?
So a few years before I was hired, I've been at USD, this is my 9th or 10th year now. And a few years before I came, the Department of Psychological Sciences, which already had a really popular psychology major, had started a behavioral neuroscience major. And very quickly, it became the fastest growing major in the college. And fast forwards to when I was hired, when behavioral neuroscience was one of the largest majors in the college. And even still, as of this year, we are one of the 2 largest science majors in the college, always alternating with biology on who has more majors. So we just exploded in popularity and student interest right away. And so it got to a point where our one department housed 2 of the largest majors in the college. And as student interest grew and as faculty needs and interests and desires to expand, our curriculum came, there just became kind of needs of our own that we needed to grow in our own way as a department. And so it's been really exciting. So this new department formed this past fall. Starting next spring, we are going to have 2 new programs within our department. We're going to have a Bachelor's of Science in Neuroscience and a Bachelor's of Science in Cognition and Behavior. And we're growing in terms of faculty. We are working on continuing to grow in terms of funding for new research spaces and collaborative research spaces. A bunch of the faculty in our department already have ongoing collaborations in the work that we're doing, which combines our areas of expertise, which has been really exciting. But the other thing is my PhD work and postdoc were at UCSD up the street. And I was told when I was a first year student in graduate school by someone he was the former chair of neurosciences, that San Diego has more neuroscientists per square mile than anywhere in the world. Now, I didn't fact check him on it, but given the number of neuroscience research institutions in the San Diego area, I would not be surprised if that held true. And so it is absolutely a neuroscience research hub in San Diego. There are so many amazing scientists doing research, which is such a value to all of the students in the San Diego area. But I think what stands out about USD is this unwavering commitment and support to undergraduate students. And while the research is incredible all over and the education is incredible at all these institutions, USD, all of our labs are geared towards supporting and developing undergraduate student researchers. And so most of the faculty in my department have large research labs supporting lots of undergraduate students, many of whom go on to pursue PhDs in graduate programs or med school, nursing school, all the different healthcare fields, or go on to work in research. And so I think just that strong commitment to developing undergraduate researchers is something I experienced at Bowdoin College, but it's really unique to give undergrads exposure to research that usually is inaccessible until graduate school. So I think when this program started at USD 10 to 15 years ago, there may have been an unexpected amount of student interest, but I think it's been wonderful that USD has been able to meet that interest and continue supporting and allowing it to grow in the way that it has. And I'm just so excited about where this department is going to go.
And what I think it's wonderful, as you mentioned, is and why I love doing this podcast is because we meet so many incredible people who are doing fantastic things in science, right? And science is so vast. There's so many things you can study within each discipline. Just in the memory department, there's so many different research and so many different ways and things that scientists are looking at. And it's so cool to showcase that to our community, right? Like there, at the end of the day, it is so very impactful. It's not just about learning in the classroom and going to college and getting a degree and doing some research. No, like what is coming out of these different labs across the nation and certainly here at USD is impactful in people's lives. You just mentioned a bunch of illnesses and things that are real, that are affecting our loved ones and people in the community, that someone who has a love for science and things they want to go into can really get into and impact change, and then go on to graduate school and go on to be scientists who may discover, the cure for some of these diseases that are so debilitating to so many, right? So, I think it's so fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun talking to you today.
And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to catch our next one.